Everybody, thanks again for joining this week. So, first of all, happy holidays, everyone. And I'm sure a lot of you are busy and either out of school now or busy with holiday parties, COVID style, and it's definitely a crazy time in the world. As things are definitely locking down again for a lot of the world. So appreciate your time if you're stuck at home now and spending your time with me today. And this is my 25th episode of this live game design show. And so if you don't know, that's each episode's 2 hours, so there's about 50 hours now of total content available just on my part of the CG Spectrum YouTube channel. And so, hopefully those of you that are aspiring game designers or interested in game design, game production, or anything related, hopefully you know about, all my previous streams and, have gone back and looked at those. I think there's some good nuggets in there depending on what you're interested in, for things that can help you understand games, game development, game design, and anything related to games, there. And so, again, hopefully you enjoy the 50 plus hours of content that's available for you there. So just a quick shameless plug there. Now, a little bit order of business. If you are watching this live or watching it this week recorded, keep in mind the next 2 weeks, we will not have a live stream. CG Spectrum will be closed. I'll be away for the holidays, but all of the CG Spectrum talks are canceled for the next 2 weeks, starting next week and the week after. So we'll resume as normal in January. I believe that is January 4th. Let me just double check. 5th. So I will be back here on January 5th. And also, just as a quick warning, I'm going to be delaying my live stream an hour for some other scheduling conflicts. And so I'll be starting this 1 hour later every day. So this is currently 3 p.m. Pacific time for me. And we'll be starting now at 4 p.m. Pacific time starting in January. So please be aware of that. So keep in mind 2 weeks off. And then starting January 5th, we're going to be, again, starting an hour later. So I'll try to make sure everybody, is aware of that, but please bear with me on that. Hopefully you can still join me, even an hour later. It'll be better for some and worse for others. So apologize about that, but maybe you East Coasters, maybe that'll get you past dinner time and let you be able to watch this after dinner. So this week is a continuation of a series that I started 2 weeks ago. And if you have not watched those first 2 weeks, I definitely would recommend maybe delaying and watching this after you've watched those 2 weeks. Now, the first 2 weeks were about world building. And those were kind of part one, part two of the same talk. And it went pretty long. And but world building in those talks was really pretty broad, and meaning it was applicable to whether you were a writer, a game designer, writing, creating movies or any kind of thing. It was really more broadly applicable, or could have been applicable, can be applicable into kind of anything, no matter what you are and who you are. This week's topic is going to dive a little deeper, but now we're going to take a step back and we're going to take kind of the same topics that we discussed the last 2 weeks. And now we're going to discuss this more specifically in game design and game development, and how do you take and build a world and a universe and a game design, and how do you intermix them really tightly? Like why is it impossible, or I should say more challenging, in my opinion, to say build a world and then try to build the gameplay mechanics? Like these are very difficult to do, and they can be done that way, but they're very risky versus today, what I would kind of talk about is like, how do you kind of build them together? And how do you kind of make these high level passes about building things together to make them a lot stronger? How does the world and everything in it, and I'm not talking about just the environment when I'm talking about the world. I'm talking about the entire universe, right? And those can be the characters, the creatures, the good guys, the bad guys, the vehicles, the things in the world, all of the locations in the world and things like that. And so whether you are building something that's modern, and everyday, and takes place in our real world, or whether you're building something that is, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, or any other genre, the same thing applies. Now, that being said, this is definitely, I'd say more important or more, useful if you are building a non-real world, right? And so there's still going to be certain things that are still applicable here if you're building say a Call of Duty or another kind of game. I mean, even look at like a Grand Theft Auto or something like that takes place in a somewhat realistic world, right? They kind of make you feel like the GTA worlds are in a real world place or something like that, but there's still creative liberties are being taken, right? And then there's games. A lot of games are like historical games. Whether you're taking a game like Assassin's Creed, which is kind of partially historical, but it's also sci-fi, right? You are a character that's from the future, and you've kind of gone back through the Animus, and you've taken these, you've taken control of these other characters. So it kind of is a duality of both, a little bit of fantasy fiction type, stuff, that takes place in the future, but predominantly this character that exists in a medieval, historical world. Of course, many other games are in different universes and stuff. But that being said, they need to kind of follow both rules, right? There's times and places for that. And so that's one of the things to sort of understand, when you're combining gameplay with world building, is that quite often these things are not necessarily always going to be fixed throughout the entirety of a game. Meaning that some games are going to be, taking place on, say, multiple worlds. Or they might take place through multiple eras in time. Even a game like Age of Empires, you progress, even though it's done by your own progression, you progress your eras of the technology and the technology levels of your game, and therefore which units are available, which buildings are available, things like that. Those are progressed through your research and through your own again, gameplay, your game actions. And whereas like another game might progress you through a storyline. Some games might use time travel, things like that, right? To progress and change things through a game. And so, but that same kind of applicability still applies even to a movie or anything, right? When you go to even a different planet, even if it's science fiction or fantasy, right? When you go off into a different world, part of what makes that world building interesting is that world building takes place in these vast different environments, right? And so even if you look at Star Trek or Star Wars or something really epic in scale, Stargate SG-1, whatever it is, anything that goes, to these different places, right? Each place often has its own rules. And so the core rules or technology or the things that the player might have access to himself. Now, let's say, take Star Trek as a perfect example. You might have the Star Trek Enterprise or whichever ship you're on at that time period. You have the technology, your phasers, your tricorders, your ship's torpedoes and lasers and those things and everything that's on your ship. But then quite often your stories go down to a planet. And your stories go down to this other world, and then in that other world, kind of new rules exist, especially in like Star Trek, where they have the prime directive of like not like having new technologies, maybe or first contact rules, things like that, right? So you might go down, and they might go down in disguise. They might just go down and not bring their high technology. The rules might change, right? And so that becomes kind of interesting, whether you're building a game or any other type of property. When you're world building, it is possible to have a different sets of, we'll call them worlds, different sets of these locations that have a different set of rules. And so that allows you to create kind of, as a game designer, more interesting opportunities and differences and stuff. So not only those worlds maybe just look different visually, but the gameplay and the scenarios and those things and everything revolved around that, whether it's the quests and the missions and things like that, are going to be or usually could be dramatically, totally night and day difference. Again, using the Star Trek analogy, like if I'm on Earth, like Earth is a relatively peaceful place, and and the Federation controls Earth. There's, from what we know, there's usually not a lot of conflict on Earth itself, and it stays relatively safe. So you're not going to get usually not going to get a lot of like conflict, wars, battles. You might have the occasional, bad guy who's a spy or something like that might happen on Earth, but it's not common within the Star Trek universe. Now, if I go to say Vulcan usually is a relatively peaceful place. They're usually my allies if I'm a Federation thing, and there's usually stuff there, but that doesn't mean there hasn't been battles on Vulcan. There hasn't, Vulcan's had its fair share of problems, and all sorts of bad things have happened to Vulcan over the course of the history of Star Trek. So you don't always know 100%, where that conflict's going to come in, even if it's something as simple as when Spock, if you remember in the original Star Trek series, had this thing called Ponfur, and he had to go back and like release his rage and and his stuff. And so he had to get in fights there to kind of fight for his wife, or girlfriend, whatever it was, his mate at the time and stuff. And so there's an example of that. Could be kind of mixed of like slightly conflicting but not too bad. And then contrast that to say going to the Klingons, right? In the Klingon homeworld, especially in most eras of the Star Trek universe, they're extremely hostile, extremely violent people, and things like that. So in those cases, that's going to be usually a lot of conflict, and you're probably going there to fight or try to make peace, but it's generally not going to be a pleasant experience, right? So I'm trying to just show you concrete examples of how within one universe there can be a lot of differences, right? There can be a lot of things that happen. And, and even if it's a modern day city, if you take something like Grand Theft Auto or something like that, you might have a modern day city that's the equivalency of a New York or whatever, right? And the way that they do that is they'll break down districts. They'll break down areas. We talked about this in the last couple of weeks of how you can have factions and you can have, places and regions within a world, whether that's the entirety of the world or whether it's just the entirety of a city. But just like in our real world today, not every country, if you're American like I am, like not every country is favorable to Americans, right? And so there's hostile places, there's dangerous places, there's things like that in the world that I have to be careful as an American when I travel to, because the whole world is not a safe place, right? And in the same way that if I go to a big city like New York and I'm not familiar with it, there is districts there that I got to be a little bit careful of. Los Angeles, any big cities always have dangerous places and safe places, and the places where the rich people kind of tend to live and the places where the poor live, and places where there's more criminals, whatever. And so GTA and stuff will use that concept, like with factions and these different things, to allow a differences of what's happening in there. Like, is the place, first of all, like, is it safe or is it dangerous or is it neutral, right? And then through that, and also just like in today, you could have different levels of, we'll call them technology, right? Like even in today's modern day world, you could go into a zone that was very high tech, and they had high-tech security systems, alarms, and then could have guards with machine guns and all this kind of stuff that it could be almost militaristic in its defensiveness, and things like that, which dramatically could change the gameplay than if I go into a world that's very poor, very run down, things like that. There's gang members all over the place. The gangs are fighting amongst themselves, and it's not safe for me anywhere. That could be a polar opposite in the gameplay, right? And so how I play that game in that region, that place, and even the technologies that exist and the things that I would use or the things that I would do could be completely and radically different, even in a modern day world, right? So don't always make the assumption that modern day is really easy because it's all homogeneous, in its gameplay or in its things. That's not really actually true, right? Now it is more cohesive than say going to potentially an alien or science fiction type world or a fantasy world or things like that. But the same general principles would exist even if I'm in, the Tolkien's Lord of the Rings worlds, and I'm in Middle Earth. The types of things that I would encounter in the Kingdom of Man and the different things that happen there is a very different type of world and experience than if I, than when I go to Elvendor and I'm with the elves, right? And there's magic, and there's all this kind of stuff that happens in that world that's totally different than the Kingdom of Man, right? And then if I go to the world of the orcs, that's very, very hostile, right? And then you could have other worlds, that are underground, the dwarfs and things like that, and their world, and their ancient world is very different, right? So every one of those worlds helps create differences, right? And helps create a more interesting world and franchise. But I want you to see that each of those worlds can have very different gameplay, right? And different levels of things in them, different types of creatures, different types of characters, different types of quests, and different experiences all together. And it doesn't mean that you can't have a game be one continuous homogeneous area and world, right? You can have that. And some games do that. You could put a game in the Vietnam War era or World War II, and you're predominantly, in the jungles of Vietnam or in one town in the Nazi occupied, thing trying to survive, right? That can be done. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? The thing that the thing that changes out of that, or what you don't get is variety. And so in a game, you have to be a little bit careful in that, a movie is typically like, an hour and a half or 2 hour experience. And so if you have a movie like Band of Brothers or something that's predominantly taking place in one era, in one place, in one, thing, and everybody has kind of the same guns, there's just one enemy, relatively, right? Although even the German enemies can be a little bit different. You could have German foot soldiers, German officers, German snipers, German tanks, German aircraft, right? And each of those is different types of enemies and different types of stuff. But generally it's that one thing, right? The German and Nazis, are your enemy, and it's fairly straightforward. But, if you want to make a 20-hour game, if you want to make a 40-plus hour game, putting that entire game in one location with one art style, with one set of enemies, with one set of gameplay, for all intents and purposes, it's simpler, it's easier, but it's going to be dramatically harder to keep that interesting, to keep that fun, to keep the players having stuff that's new to want to look to explore and worlds to explore. And that's kind of the nature of games and game design and game development, right? And so be aware of that as we start to dive in here. I want you to see that a lot of, in world building, a lot of what we're trying to do is create variety, and create these interesting things that people can come and explore and do. And there has to be enough there that people want to keep coming back and back and back. And whether that's for a single game, whether that's for multiple games, whether that's for, a game and a movie, or however you skin the cat in your world, in your IP, and when you're building this thing again, right? The point of this world building talk is to try and build something much bigger than just a single product, right? But even within a single product, within a single game, even if it's a 10 to 20 hour game, there's still the same challenge of variety and making things interesting, which we'll get into here more in a minute. But I want you to understand that within that opportunity, gameplay is just as important, if you're a game designer, as keeping the world interesting. Like it is not enough, in my opinion, and I think that can be validated, through a lot of sources. But it generally is not enough. Say this again, not enough to have one small set of gameplay, even if your world is super diverse and you're going through new art styles and new worlds to explore, and things like that, and the story can be changing. But changing the story and changing the art, in my opinion, throughout a course of a 10 or 20 hour game is not enough if your core mechanics are too small, right? You have to have a certain amount of diversity in those mechanics, to really make it interesting, right? And so don't discount that. And it's a slippery slope, because too many mechanics means it's also potentially hard to develop. to time consuming to develop, and things like that, right? So you can fail by trying to put too much in, but you also can fail by having too little, right? So the key to being a really great game designer and world builder in general is knowing how much to put into something, and what does your product really need, and what does your team have the capability of building. And then as a world builder, what I'm also trying to do is show you guys how to put these hooks in again. Like, how do I put in these little threads so that maybe day one I don't have that thing in there, but maybe through DLC, maybe through live operations, expansion packs, sequels, or whatever, at least I've at a minimum set some guidelines for how to expand the universe, right? And so anyways, let's jump in a little bit. And please, again, everybody, please ask questions. And I'm happy to try to answer this. This, again, may probably turn into a multi-week conversation. So we'll pick this back up in January with everybody. And because, again, this is world building in general is a topic I could literally spend an entire course, i.e. a year or at least a semester teaching. This is not an easy topic. This is not a small topic. So please don't expect, even through now being video number 3 and 6 hours of me blabbing about this stuff, that I'm going to teach you everything, right? So in January, we're probably going to have, I would guess, probably one more class on gameplay and world building. We're going to then probably have a class or two on writing in world building and kind of what it and how to write the stories. And how just storytelling in general, it's not even just writing, like stories and world building, just to be clear, is not about the spoken word. I mean, that's 25%, 50% at most of a story, right? It's everything that goes into that world, whether it's the visuals, the character designs, even the animations, and just everything about it is about building the story and the universe of your world, right? And so we're going to get into that, where it's not just about that, but you're going to be talking about how to build emotion, how to build all these things, and a lot of that comes through the world and the environments and the story and the gameplay and all these things. And so we're building towards that. And then again, we'll probably be jumping in then probably by early February at the latest. And we're going to try to build this together. We're going to build some examples together. We're going to sit down and build a world together, I hope, and show you really how is it done, because I find that's where people struggle. This idea, this concept of world building and game design in general, whether you're writing a pitch deck, whether you're writing a GDD, or whether you're world building, the conceptual side of game design is exponentially harder than most people realize. And I think, some of my students that are on here today can account for that, and that when you first played a bunch of games and you think that, it's going to be really easy to I got lots of ideas, how hard can it be to make that into a game, and they realize it's 10 times harder or 100 times harder than they realize when you really actually have to put it to paper. And so I think it will benefit everybody to try and have this figured out, and do some examples. So, real quick, couple shout outs. Rizomation, how's it going? Rizonian, how's it going? And the Blasphemer 666, but all three of you, welcome back. And thanks again for joining. And it looks like it's a little quiet today. There's not a lot of people on live. So you guys, please ask questions. I'm here for you. I'm doing this, because I truly do care about people and want you guys to have some great resources. This is as you're probably aware, a very hard thing for me to jump into every week. I don't spend a lot of time prepping. I think today I got 30 minutes to prep and rework this slide deck. So, again, bear with it, but, I'll do my best each week to sit up here and talk about all this stuff and hopefully, teach you guys a little bit of something along the way. And so, great. Glad this is catching your attention, and I hope this will be of interest to you. And again, please check back if you haven't seen the previous world building talks in the last 2 weeks. Please check those out. And again, stick with us, and we'll keep talking about world building and game design, because again, this is a very difficult, hard problem to do, and so I'll try to explain it a little bit better. Now, as I jump in here, what I wanted to show you guys really quick, semantically wise, I purposely kept the slides from the last 2 weeks in here. And so the slides that you see that are gray with the red head titles here are the exact same slides from last week. I'm only going to pause on each one briefly. And this will be for people like Moy or others who might be new here today. And at least you can, if you go back and review the video, you can kind of see what each topic is about. But part of why I'm doing this is so that if you guys, the super motivated people, I know Megan will probably do this. Megan is one of my super hyper motivated students right now, and I know she watches my video 1,000 times. And this is for people like her that want to go back and reference. Because what I'm going to try and do is again reference some of the areas per slides that I talked about in the last couple weeks, and now I'm going to try to make a direct one-to-one correlation in gameplay and game design. And so I want you guys to kind of see as I switch topics, like what am I talking about, right? And if you go back and watch the old videos and do a side-by-side, at least you can kind of go like, oh, okay, here's this section, this section, this section, and here's the gameplay, analogy and sort of walkthrough of each of those, right? And so I hope that will help you guys a little bit. But again, I am not gonna on the next sets of slides, for the gray slides, I'm not gonna stick on them for too long. I'm not gonna re-explain them. This is purely reference for those of you that want to kind of know where we're at in correlation to the previous weeks. All right, so similar to the ideation process, game design is and has to go through the same really level of ideation that the world building itself is, right? And just to clarify again, this is about world building is in the core essence of what world building truly is predominantly about, as the name implies, building the world, the characters, the stories. That could be, an entire universe to just a single building. Really, I mean, there's games out there, there's movies out there that take place in one room, in one building, right? And so your world doesn't necessarily need to be the entire universe. Literally, it can be one small thing. However, that being said, you will find that generally, even movies and stuff that take place in one smaller area, quite often will use flashbacks and other types of literary elements, to show even news reports or things on the TV, radio signals, things like that, to show either what has transpired in the past of what that person has done, or what happened in the world to kind of set it up, right? And quite often we need to know the history and the backstory to help us care about this character. And we don't always, again, for variety, we don't always want to know and see everything from this one person's perspective, right? Like that, even in a movie, can get kind of boring. Like I'll give you an example. I just thought of the movie I Am Legend. And that's a interesting movie if you guys haven't seen it. Post-apocalyptic. He's in New York City. So the movie takes place through a section of New York City. I wouldn't say the whole city, but there's a few times he drives through it. Will Smith stars in it, and he has a dog. So at least he's got somebody to kind of sort of talk to, right? But it's this kind of weird, lonely existence in that, yes, he takes place predominantly in his house, and then he goes to a couple locations throughout the movie and ends up dealing with some things that are kind of vampire-ish. But it's never 100% totally clear, but they're pretty much vampires, right? But it also comes back to the fact that, throughout the movie, you keep seeing flashbacks to days and weeks and whatever before the virus hit, and the things that was happening while the virus was hitting, and what happened to his family, and those kinds of things, right? So the history of that, did have more to it than just that one thing, right? And so in gameplay, in game design, it's that same sort of thing, right? Where the history and the world and all these things, in the big picture, you sort of have to know and understand how all these things are going to kind of fit together. But you need to know, what is within your game that you need, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to go into your first game. It doesn't mean that everything is going to go into, whatever, your entire product, right? But you're building out something that's interesting. You're building out a world that makes sense. You're building out a world that has a lot of logic to it. And so you're starting there, right? And so where this interesting causality comes into is that when you're building the world and you're building these gameplay mechanics again, you really want them to intermix because you really want them to strengthen each other. You want them to make sense and have logical sense, right? And so whether you have started with game mechanics or whether you have started with the world building, you don't want to go too far. And the first lesson really here is that a really great designer, in my opinion, again, is somebody who knows how far to take things, how far and where to go with things before they switch back from one to the other, right? So, in my opinion, you'll fail if you do too much of one thing, and I don't care what that is. You can spend too much time on game mechanics. You can spend too much time just building out the combat system. You can spend too much time writing the story. You can do a lot of those things. And if you spend too much time in that one area, then when you start to switch to other areas, you suddenly realize there's disconnect. You suddenly realize like, ooh, that didn't quite work, right? You set up this whole thing that you thought was going to be this great story, and then you realize when you start designing the game mechanics, you're like, that's not very fun. Like, and I used the reference in the previous weeks of like, some IPs I worked in where the main character, he had two pistols. They were identical. He had these twin pistols, and those were his key signature pistols. And ultimately, he only uses those in the movie that this game was supposed to be based off of. And as a world builder, as a game designer, I couldn't work with it. I ultimately had to cancel the project and we didn't sign it, didn't take it on because the director and the person who initially thought up the base world, because it was the game was going to be based on this movie, was unwilling to compromise. He was unwilling to change because his character that was his signature pistols, and he didn't want to change those, right? And so, but he never thought of this as a video game. And never realized that, and he was stuck in his ways. He was stubborn, and this was a key identifier for his character. But in a video game, you're trying to make a 20-hour game, and if your character only has two pistols, and I can't do anything else, I can't use anything else, it was too restrictive for me, and I didn't feel in the end that we could make a great product. And that was a perfect example of like, this world existed, I tried to shove the gameplay into it, right? And there's certain rules in gameplay in a game genre. So take like a first-person shooter, like this was supposed to be. How many first-person shooters out there only have one gun? Probably not a whole lot, if any, right? I mean, you generally want to have a variety of weapons. And each one of those varieties of weapons also offers differences in gameplay. I mean, all the way back to Doom with its 10 weapons, right? Some weapons have, a lot of ammo or unlimited ammo. Some, they don't do a lot of damage, but you always have something. A shotgun gives blast damage and pushes people back. The BFG, was a rocket launcher and did stuff. The sniper rifle shoots long range. Every gun typically exists, or most guns, have categories and classes because they change up the gameplay. Right? So this is in parallel conceptually with this, for the same reason that you might want to have different districts in a world or different planets to go to or different places to go to. You're building variety, right? And players will get bored if you just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And so it's a pretty challenging, not impossible, because again, there's been games without guns in them, right? But if you're going to take the guns out, or if you're only going to put one gun in the game, what are you going to replace it with to make that experience fun and interesting for the player? And so that's where one of the big challenges is, and that's why typically in a game, even a simple first-person shooter will have 10 or 20 different guns in it because they're all solving different purposes, right? But you could get into a game like Borderlands, which has tens of thousands of guns, right? And there's every extreme, from games that have literally almost no guns, or maybe like one even simple, gun, or, especially some stealth games and stuff have very limited, guns or weapons or dart guns that are only knock you unconscious or whatever. But that's not their core gameplay. That's not their core game. Their game is not about guns. Their game is about stealth and being a spy and doing all these other things. So they implement a lot of other game mechanics that fit the world, that fit the IP. It's not about pulling out my gun and going Rambo and shooting everybody. It's, I can be more James Bond or some other spy type person that is not into killing people. Or I could be Jason Bourne, or somebody who, yes, does occasionally use guns, but he also uses a lot of hand-to-hand type quick stuff, or things where I'm going to go in and choke people out and do stuff against them that way, versus just using a gun, right? So the gun does not have to be the end all to be all, but it's about creating variety and knowing what I'm going to start with. But if I'm creating a first person shooter, I need to know the rules and generalization of what is needed in the gameplay side of what goes into a first person shooter, what goes into an RTS, what goes into a stealth game, right? What are those things? What's that kind of MVP, or at least that initial starting point for what I'm building in my world? And then how do I build on top of that, right? And how do I make that fit what my IP is? So, Rosemation, how's it going? And Mike the Raptor, how's it going? Thanks again, guys, for joining me, and welcome today. So, the thing that you've got to kind of, figure out is we keep kind of going back and forth, right? You can start building this universe. You can start building some world. You can start building characters. You can start building these things in your world building. But at some point, you have to kind of step back and say, is that fun? Like, is that something that this particular character is gonna want to do? Is that going to be interesting? Is that going to be interesting now? Is that going to be interesting, in 10 hours from now, or in 3 games from now, or 2 movies from now, or whatever that you're building? What makes that thing interesting, right? Is there enough diversity? Is there enough stuff there? And so you kind of have to take a look again, is like, you want to do a little bit of one thing and then, like build some world and then build some gameplay and build some world and build some gameplay, right? And keep staggering those, keep working on those, if not simultaneously, at least kind of after each other to sort of build. Again, it's like an onion. I use this onion analogy a lot, but you don't want to try to take a big bite out of an onion, right? And dive like super deep into it, it's one that tastes bad, but two, you're going through all these layers, but you don't know what the rest of this onion kind of is. So you take this chunk out of this thing, right? But now you got another, 180 degrees or 200, 300 degrees of kind of information that's missing. And then suddenly it's like this big chunk comes out of it. And it's like, yeah, it's got some story. It's got some gameplay. It's got a few things in there, but we deep dive and we really detail those out in like uber detail, and don't realize that rest of that onion has layer upon layer upon layer of other details that now don't fit, right? And so now I got to start filling some of that hole in that I took a big bite out of, and I have to start redoing certain things, and that's a big problem. And so when you're starting in gameplay mechanics, you have to, understand, like, am I starting with gameplay mechanics or am I starting with the world, right? And what does the IP dictate, but what does the game genre dictate again, and is there something there that I know about? And I could be doing something completely new and unique and different and special, and that's okay, and stuff. But again, if you don't understand what the variety is, or how is this going to be unique or interesting, compelling, as a world, then you're going to fail, right? And you're going to kind of bang your head around things. And so knowing what you have to start with, understand day one, like, or at least early on, like, is this an existing IP? And if so, what does that have in it, right? Is it an existing game, existing movie, anything existing? Even if it's modern day, if it's historical, whatever, those may have existing things. If I go back and do an ancient an ancient warfare in Rome game, or if I go back and do a Nazi World War II game, each of those have specific things in them that you already know. A lot of the characters, a lot of the types of enemies, the weapons, what the universe and the world's locations, the status of a lot of these things to start with, but you may not know specifics, right? And so at least you kind of know this rough, again, idea of like, okay, here's my beginner world, right? Now, I might take some creative liberties, as I'm building out some of these things. It might be changing a few things or whatever, but I kind of know where I'm starting. I can kind of understand where I'm starting, and I can work towards something. And that's important for the gameplay just as much as the world itself. So then next we'll talk about researching ideas. And we'll leave this up just for 1 second again for those of you that are catching up here. So, now, researching gameplay ideas. So taking that idea of researching general ideas for your world and applying it to gameplay. This is really no different than researching your world building ideas. So this conceptually is pretty much the same. The one main difference can be that you're probably spending more time playing games and understanding games as references versus on the world building side, you're probably looking at books, and other stuff, there. But in general, you're going to be Googling a lot of things. You're going to be playing games, and you're going to be trying to understand what is fun, right? And what is it going to be there? And this is an area, as you guys can kind of see, this side of my upper shelves, like board games. From a game designer's perspective, especially strategy games, but a lot of tactical strategy type games, but it's applicable into a lot of other things. I love board games, and they're things that can really inspire you a lot to try to understand new levels of socialization, new levels of tactics. I use the analogy of chess a lot. Why is chess still playable after so many hundreds or thousands of years that it's been around, right? And how popular. Look at the Queen's Gambit, which is currently on the top of the charts in Netflix. And these things, these are old ideas that are still really popular, right? And why is that? And those are the kinds of things that we have to understand that new ideas, new gameplays, new games are not always the best, right? They're not always. Not to say that they're wrong, but something that's completely fresh and new from a game design perspective isn't always the right choice, right? And so understanding what's out there, understanding the conventions of what your genre has and what you need as a starting point, at least as a foundation, and then understand why do I now really want to do that? And why did they do that, right? And what were the mechanics that these guys were trying to achieve when they were trying to build that, right? And then do I want to stick with that, or do I want to change it all? Do I want to completely and totally change it, or just improve it a little bit, or change it for another reason, right? And then ultimately, do I want to change that to fit my IP and to fit my world, to fit my specific game, right? And what makes sense, in my specific game and in my world, and what are the rules and the consistencies of those things that make sense in my world, right? So, for example, if you're doing a modern day Call of Duty game and everything was modern day, and and you took some sort of a sci-fi element to it. I'm trying to think of a good example. A laser gun or something that just was completely and totally out of place. Yeah, you could add a laser gun into Call of Duty, but if you didn't really explain it, if you didn't really show it there, people might suddenly get whoa, wait a second, why do I have an M4 and suddenly you've got a rail gun and a laser gun, and whatever, and that doesn't make sense in the universe because we're being told this is modern day, and we know that modern day, doesn't have that, or at least we don't think it has it, right? So is this experimental? Is it, does it work there? And so that's where, again, tying in the world and tying in the game mechanics, you kind of have to make some of that make sense, right? Because you could add things. There's nothing that stops you from adding things. There's nothing that stops you from putting in anything you want into a game, right? But if the rules, and we'll talk about that here again in a second, are not consistent, then we're in trouble, or we can get in trouble because players, again, don't, may react negatively to something that doesn't make sense to them, right? The rules of the universe need to be consistent. And so gameplay and game design has the exact same problems as the world. And so this is, again, where you have to define your world and the rules of your world, and then the game design and the gameplay mechanics and everything in the game have to kind of meet that. And they kind of have to keep working with it, at least at the same level, right? They got to be working together. And if you're really, really good at this, and this is the hardest thing, I think, is that when you're world building or when you're game designing, they both inspire each other, right? They're both, when you're researching these things, like, like it's not kind of cart before the horse. It's not like, oh, I come up with a world and then the gameplay mechanics will follow. Quite often it's actually the opposite. In fact, it'll often be like, I'll be researching something to create, say, an interesting looking character. And then through that, it'll give me an idea for like a gameplay mechanic, right? And so I may Google image search, like, whatever it is, dragons or something like that. And I may not even be thinking about, or even just something even more generic, like just alien creatures, and I'll be looking through a bunch of concept art, just on Google. And I'm looking for cool pictures that I think would inspire me, that I would show an artist, that I'm building the world in my mind there. But if I know what I'm looking for, if I keep an open mind, suddenly I'm like, oh wait, that creature, he's got some weird ass weapon on him, and like he's got this thing, and it comes over, and he's holding it this way, and it's got some thing on it, and you can see that it's firing some weird thing in the picture, and you're like, oh, that's awesome. Like that inspired me. Like that was cool. And suddenly now I'm back to my document for gameplay and game design, right? And so that was those can be cases of where the visuals and the world building and what I'm doing there suddenly inspired a whole new gameplay feature that could become could become one of the key signatures of the game that you didn't even think about from day one, because it just, inspiration comes from so many different areas, right? It comes through so many different things. So when you're researching, keep an open mind that I usually will keep my GDD, for lack of a better definition, my game design document that has all my gameplay in it. And when I'm world building, I will have both of those kind of open simultaneously. And I don't tend to, sometimes there's times where I will work for hours or days in one and not flip over to the other. But there are so many times, and the more traditional thing is every 5 or 10 minutes, I'm writing something. I go, oh wait, let me make a note over here, and then I'll jump into the other document and make like something that inspired me, that I thought of, that worked in conjunction with that mechanic, and or something I would need, to make it fun. So, for example, even in gameplay mechanics, if I'm brainstorming gameplay mechanics and I'm thinking about new stuff and I'm looking at new ideas for new ways to move, for example. Let's just say I'm focused initially on movement systems and movement things. And then I might be like, okay, well, I know that I want to put swimming in, right? And I start with swimming. And then, I'm thinking about gameplay, game design. Like, why is that fun? Like, what do I do when I'm swimming? Like, is it just a traversal mechanic that I'm going to get from point A to point B? And then I start thinking about, well, do I go underwater? Okay, maybe I've got a scuba tank, or I've got some equivalency of in my tech level that I can now swim underwater, right? So now, okay, what do I do underwater? Okay, well, I need to encounter some things. And then I'm like, oh, so I need some alien creatures. I'm on an alien planet, and I need to have alien fish, and like, so suddenly now I'm back in my world building document going like, note, I need alien fish for my underwater stuff, and I need dangerous things underwater because it can't just be safe. Oh wait, I need dangerous things underwater? Crap, I gotta go back into my gameplay design. Note to self, I need weapons for underwater, right? And so, so all these things keep inspiring each other back and forth, right? And if you're really doing that well, that's kind of how you feed yourself, right? Part of that is your world and your universe, and like, how do you make that fun and interesting, and things like that. And then in the same hand, that same inspiration can inspire you to in game mechanics, and you keep kind of going back and forth. And that doesn't mean that, like, for example, if I know suddenly now that I need underwater weapons, I don't have to stop right now and go spend an hour or a day or a week designing the underwater weapon system in detail. But at least in my document, I've got myself a note that goes underwater weapons, ! Like I got to come back to this at some point. But I might need to follow my train of thought of where I'm going with this whole thing, understand a little bit more about what does underwater really mean, And like, is this going to become a big part of my game? Is this just like 1% of my game? Is it, 90% of my game, right? And how far do I take water? And so I'll start asking myself those things. And so I'm bouncing around that problem and that question that keeps going around about how interesting is water? How diverse is water? What can I do in the water? What exists in the water, right? And so in some cases, then, it can keep going back and forth, for a while on that brainstorming of like, oh, well, okay, do I want a submarine? Do I want, now I got back to gameplay mechanics, like underwater vehicles, question mark, right? Do I need to have transportation? Is it just me with my, my flat feet or my fins or whatever I'm using to swim underwater, a little bit better? Is that all it is, right? Or do I need more than that? And then I may not know that, but then when I start designing my creatures, and I might come up with some ideas again for some really scary creatures that inspires me to have like some better weapons underwater. And then, I might design a really fast creature that's underwater, like a really fast swimming creature. And I'm like, okay, crap. Well, that's cool. I love that fast swimming creature. But like my player character right now is designed to swim kind of slow. And like he doesn't, he holds his breath and he doesn't have a lot of like time underwater. And so these really fast creatures, which I might suddenly fall in love with, are really challenging to do. And so now I may jump back in and go like, okay, now I need a little thing, a little device that like, I forget what they call little UAV type things that I hold on to. And, and that pushes me around the water. And now suddenly if I grab that little vehicle, it's like riding a motorcycle, right? I can zip along and I can go super fast. And so now like when that creature's, in that area, maybe I happen to have one of those things and I grab it and now I can chase and I can do the equivalent of like car chases underwater. And so it just keeps building and building and building and building. But it's like each area is inspiring itself, right? And inspiring each other. And so I'm going back and forth as I'm researching. And really, this could really be called brainstorming, right? And I want you guys to kind of see how that process between world building and gameplay mechanics really works, and how I kind of simultaneously will go back and forth, even, like I said, having both documents literally open side by side, and kind of going back and forth to understand what is in the world, why is that interesting, and then what mechanics do I need to have to make that work. And then at some point I can then ask myself like, ooh, this is getting too complicated, right? And so now suddenly my game mechanics list starts going like this, and I'm like, ooh, this is maybe not what I want to do, right? Like maybe my game's a stealth game, not an underwater, game, right? And I'm not building Subnautica. I'm building, Splinter Cell or whatever. Like what could have just started with me wanting to swim across the water, across a river, across a lake, to get from, one side to the other, suddenly turned into this massive systems, right? And then also now all this, this accommodating art and all these other things in the world. And so you have to catch yourself and go like, okay, well, that's not a bad idea. Now, maybe that stuff exists. Maybe that stuff is going to be there and we allude to it for a sequel. Maybe that's not something this game does, right? So now that could be a reason for example, why do I avoid the water? Right? Why is water dangerous? It's not, like some games, water is just a barrier. It's just like, nah, your guy's an idiot. He can't swim, right? And we all get frustrated, I think, with games like that where, water, I think, for me personally, is always one of these like catch-22s of like, why in the heck are you stopping me? Like there's, an inch of water and I can't go into it. Like it's, and I'm a special forces, Navy SEAL, and I'm, now I'm the Wicked Witch of the West, that if I get wet, I'm going to melt, right? Or it just, it stops me. And that suspension of disbelief frustrates players often because, again, that's not the world that I'm expecting. I expect to be able to swim in water if I'm a Navy SEAL, right? And so that's where it can become problematic for players, where they may get frustrated. So, but I understand there's limitations both in time and technology and so many other things that will keep people from being able to have the time to develop those features correctly, right? And so that's okay, but how could you make that better? Now, in a modern everyday world, that gets a little bit trickier, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be hazards in the world. this time last year, actually, probably almost this exact week last year, I was in Australia. And I traveled, for over a month in Australia with my girlfriend, and we went across the whole east coast of Australia almost, and incredible trip. But we went up to this island. It's the biggest sand island in the world. And the thing it's I forget the times and the size and scale now, but it's like 8 hours of driving just to get from like one. You can drive 4-wheel drive vehicles on it. There's no paved roads or anything, and you can literally drive on the beach. And it was this incredible, experience. And in the middle of the island, there's actually freshwater lakes that are some of the purest in the world. So like we could go swim there. But like we would, there was times we wanted to stop, especially on the I guess it was the east coast of the island, which was the main one we were driving up, and we were like, oh, just beautiful, incredible beaches. Like I want to go swim in that, right? We'd stop the car and thought about it a couple times, and then we talked to somebody and they're like, no. There was great white sharks. Like you could see fishermen fishing on the beach, like literally on the beach with their fishing poles, catching great white sharks. So in that particular case, if I was building an IP, there is and could be, even in a modern day area and location, probably a pretty good reason I don't want to go swimming, right? I could be a Navy SEAL or not, but even if I was a Navy SEAL, I probably don't want to go purposely swimming with the great white sharks. So I'm just saying, in that particular case, you could make an argument that that there was a reason why this gameplay mechanic that I expected was unavailable to me because the story or something explained it a little bit or whatever, right? And that can be sometimes slightly better more palatable than just not allowing it to happen. But why not have something on an alien world where or even just our normal everyday world where you define initially in your world that this place is dangerous, right? It doesn't matter whether it's underwater, whatever. There could just be a whole section of somewhere that's just kind of like, dude, don't go there, right? And maybe we let you go there, but you're going to die pretty quickly. Like you jump in the water, the shark hits you within 30 seconds, or some strange alien creature, they come and, kill you and game over, that kind of thing, right? So you establish early on that thing is there. You establish that thing's kind of interesting. You might even see like some weird, interesting stuff floating around. You might see some stuff out there that entices you, and the world seems kind of interesting, and you're told about some strange creatures out there. Maybe there's some boats with some people that live out there, and you're like, okay, what is it about that thing that's kind of cool, right? But that doesn't mean that like on game one or whatever that you would have to have access to that, right? You could literally not give people access to water until the second game, when you had more time to create those mechanics to properly support that whole new thing. But again, like I've talked about world building, you're building out a world, you're building out a universe, and you're trying to make this thing interesting, right? And so what you're doing there is you're saying like, okay, I'm foreshadowing almost, or at least opening up again these threads, as I call them, to there's something there, right? And you could choose later on to come back to that or not. Maybe even later in the game you come back to it. There's lots of ways that are there, but by creating these things that are kind of interesting, even if it's just a little bit of dialogue, a little bit of story, something I kind of see off in the distance. It's like the Loch Ness Monster or the, Bigfoot or something, right? Like I get a glimpse of it. I kind of know it's there and you're like, okay, like sort of interesting, but then a whole nother world could exist. Look at Star Wars Episode 1, as much as everybody hated Jar Jar Binks. The Gungans, were these weird creatures when you met them. They were awkward, all these kinds of things. And, and you didn't think much of it. And then eventually Obi-Wan and the Jedis were, in trouble. They wanted to flee, and they happened to have their little underwater breathing apparatus thing, which, was kind of funny that I find that they were actually carrying that, but, it is what it is. It was small, so sure, they had it in their robes somewhere. And so Jar Jar takes them swimming, then suddenly they get deeper and deeper and deeper, and then the next thing you know, they're at these big underwater cities, right? And you would have never known about that if you just come to the planet, and things like that. But they kind of foreshadowed a little bit when you look back at his dialogue and you kind of understood that there was like something was down there, right? But you didn't know what exactly it was, and then of course, once you actually went down to that city, even though the Gungans and Jar Jar people were, that you loved them or hated them, it opened up the world into a bigger place, and that from the surface, the world can look like one thing, right? The surface of the planet, I could be on this planet, especially an alien planet, right? And I can look out with my eyes and I can perceive it as something, right? I can perceive it as this thing that's there, and then realize later on that there's much more there, right? There could be underground cities, there could be underwater cities, there could be invisible cities, and all these things. And all it takes for you as a world builder is to know that exists in your world, right? And then to know how to put in some little hooks, put in some little things so that those things make sense, so that if you ever decide you want to unveil that thing, right? And whether it's, again, in the same game or different games or whatever it is, that, you can go there and it doesn't feel completely and totally contrived. So, and again, for those of you that are new, and haven't been watching my channel, Moy or others, I did a talk, I think 4 weeks ago, something like that. Not too far off. I did another talk on this before we started world building on ideation. And so if you're new to this, and if this is the first time you're seeing me talk, or you're not familiar with my previous live streams, go back and look at, I have a whole talk on ideation that talks about how do I come up with ideas for games. That talk is also very relevant to this. So sorry if I'm flooding you with lots of information. This will be like 8 or more hours of stuff, but it's all very relative. And lastly, before we move on, there was a talk in the same week, or the week before ideation. I did a talk on systemic game design. Now, if you guys missed that, also please go back and watch that. And I want to reiterate why that's important. Why is systemic game design so important, right? So we are in systemic game design, we are building out systems of things. We are defining categories of stuff. We are defining things that make sense in our world. And so whether I'm building out the world itself, if I'm doing world building, or whether I'm doing gameplay mechanics, right? Each of these, if you take a systemic game design approach, it will make your job 1,000 times easier, because a lot of things just make sense. A lot of things have to follow rules. So if you look at world building, and if you look at game design, and you look at the intersection of those two, a lot of these things have to exist for most worlds to exist, or they have to have some relevance. Again, if you're going to make a game and you're going to make a world that makes sense, again, there's always ways to break the rules. There's always ways to do that. But as you start to, again, have gameplay mechanics and world building, and you're doing these together, right? There can be a lot of things where, you like that underwater stuff, right? The underwater systems and the game mechanics there, and the underwater world that we just talked about. You might know, first of all, there's water in the game, right? And there's water on this planet. Maybe not the whole universe. Maybe, this could just be one, like the Gungan homeworld. This could be one planet that has water, and it doesn't have to be Tatooine, right? It could be a planet, that's predominantly water, and if you look at, like a movie like Waterworld with Kevin Costner is kind of weird, and whatever as that movie was, it was predominantly taking place on on Earth that was flooded, and there was little atolls that were really more man-made floating boats or little cities floating on the water, but were basically boats. And then there was rumor of land and, and stuff like that. But all of these people in their world only knew this thing, right? They only knew that part of the world. So the idea of land was very foreign to them, right? But there was a mythology of land. There was the hint that land existed. There was rumors, and these things. And so even though 99% of the movie takes place on water, they built it up slowly over time that land existed somewhere, or at least we believed that existed somewhere, right? And so if they had just like built up that 99% of the movie was all on water and land never existed, and the entire planet was flooded, and then suddenly they just bumped into an island that was land, you'd be like, oh, okay, well, I guess that's cool, but it would feel out of place just because their whole mythos, their religions, their societies, their gameplay systems, right? They only had boats and they had spears, and things like that. They didn't have gunpowder. They didn't have manufacturing per se. They didn't have a lot of food. The food was very scarce. Water was very scarce, even though it was water world, right? Distillation of the water, things like that was important. So if you start looking at like even a water world type world, like all of their core game mechanics, and even sorry if I ruin it for those of you that haven't seen it, but Kevin Costner is also kind of a mutant. He's evolved and actually has gills, and he can breathe underwater, right? And that's the thing that sets him apart and makes him special. But it determines a lot of his personality. It determines a lot of who he is and why he is and what he does and what he can do. And then he can swim down to the old cities and get to them because he can breathe underwater. Now, that's all the types of stuff that are perfect game mechanics. So if you were to make a game out of Waterworld, right, you would have this universe of these things and know that stuff was there. But like if land didn't exist and Kevin Costner didn't have gills and some of those other things, then the world would kind of just be a pretty boring place, right? After a while, you're like, yeah, been there, seen that. There's some pirates, there's some atolls, there's whatever, there's lots of water as far as you can see, and that's the game, right? And so that's, they had to, take it a lot farther. But if you had tried to make a 20-hour game out of just what was on Waterworld, it probably wouldn't have been the most exciting thing in the world. And I barely sat through the movie in and of itself, even though I kind of liked the movie because I like Kevin Costner. But it's not something that, I probably would have made a sequel to or things like that, right? Because it was very limited in its world. So let's see. Why does every channel, this is such a so frustrating. We get spammed at least once a class with somebody spamming, and just such a sad world. Thank you, Big Glob. I'm glad you liked the systemic game design class. I'm glad that helped you. So, moving along here, we're a little bit slow. I apologize, but I know I'm diving a little bit deep into some of these subjects, but I'm trying to kind of give you guys some concrete examples, right? Because this topic specifically, world building and game design, and both of them together. Again, without concrete examples, it's really easy to talk about theory. It's really easy just to be like, yeah, go do this. Like, go add some fun stuff. Add some world, add some gameplay, slam it together. You'll be fine. Don't worry about it, right? And it's kind of not true, right? This is a harder problem than people realize, and it's definitely a mastercraft level of complexity as a game designer. And again, what I'm trying to show you is how to strengthen both, right? How do I make an interesting world, which makes an interesting game, which makes an interesting TV show, which makes an interesting toy line, and so on and so forth, right? And so keep that in mind that ultimately, when we're building these things, right, they are going to be the strongest if you work on them simultaneously and you intermix all of your ideas and you work on them together. And again, doesn't mean you don't go down some rabbit holes and working on a story for a while, and that doesn't, and then that when you're writing that story, that it doesn't make for compelling game mechanics. But I would question yourself if you're doing that, right? If you can go write a story for a day, a week, a month, or a year, and never once have an idea for what gameplay that's going to bring to your game, and how that's going to make your universe, your characters, the player characters' skills and abilities, and all these things an interesting place to live in and play in. again, assuming you want to make a game, right, out of what this thing that you're building. And since we're talking about games today, I'm assuming you're making a game out of your world. If you can go work on a story for a long period of time and not figure out every 5 minutes a new idea for a gameplay mechanic, you're probably not writing your story the right way. I hate to say that, but that these will all both naturally spawn different gameplay mechanics. Even like down to, I'll pull it off the shelf because I just happened to look back and see it here. If you guys can kind of see this. So I worked on this game called Bruce Lee, Quest of the Dragon. Sorry, reflection's horribly bad. This was an original Xbox game, and this was a game that was based on an original story, actually, that Bruce Lee himself wrote. And I was very, very fortunate. I got to work with his wife and his daughter, Shannon, and Linda was his wife, and they really opened up to us, and they opened up a bunch of movie scripts and story concepts that Bruce wrote before his death, and that he was working on some new ideas for new movies, and a lot of them weren't full fleshed out scripts. A lot of them were, 20 pages or 50 pages of just like some story, and so we had at least a nugget of a place to start. We kind of knew some story where we were starting with that game, right? But we also knew it was an action adventure martial arts game, right? And so this was not a one-on-one fighter. This game is not, that, but we had the challenge of we were making a more of a God of War style game in that it was supposed to be big levels, right? With predominantly martial arts combat. Didn't mean that we weren't going to have some weapons. But actually, I don't even remember if we had guns. It's been so long. That's whatever it's been. Man, that was 1998, I believe. I was working on that game. So forgive me if my memory is a little bit lapsed, getting senile here. So I don't think we had guns, and I think that was part of the mythos and part of the structure that we were not allowing, and part of the limitations of the universe was that Bruce generally, himself would never use guns and never do things. And we had, just a quick aside, even other funny limitations initially of, like one of the limitations that Linda, his wife, believed in. And if you look at all of Bruce's movies, which were filmed in the 60s, Bruce never hit a woman. And this was something that he was very passionate about, and something that he would never do. Like in real life or in the movies, he didn't feel like hitting a woman was the right thing. And it was actually, as we started to develop the story and we needed to have more diversity of characters, this question kind of kept coming up of like, is this just a bunch of guys in the movie? Is this just a big dude flick? Or is it like, is there women in there, and can we have women to fight against, right? And we went back and forth morally for a very long time about this because we wanted to stay true to Bruce and his beliefs. And it was interesting that Shannon ultimately, along with Linda's support, came to the conclusion that Bruce was always very progressive, and that even though in the movies and things back then, and of course in real life, he would never have ever hit a woman. But knowing that, movies and the world progressed through the years, not to say it's appropriate to hit a woman today in any way, shape, or form. I don't believe it is. But in a movie and stuff, there is bad guys, and there's lots of women that are out there that, kick butt, and they're martial artists, and, and there's lots of, whether they're superheroes or whatever, right? There is women out there who can fight and do fight, and men fighting women. And so they believe that Bruce would have progressed with that if he had still been alive, and he would have allowed it, and he would have done it. And so that was, a concession that we made. But that being said, we also knew that like we had to go through a world that was big enough. We had to have a variety of martial arts. We had to have a variety of certain moves. We knew the world had to be of a certain size, and all these kinds of things. And so then it inspired us to like, okay, we've got to go like figure out, like, there's not just Jeet Kune Do, which was Bruce's style. I mean, it made sense that Bruce and anybody related to Bruce would fight with JKD, but not, the bad guys shouldn't be using that same style necessarily unless it was a storyline of one of his students or something that maybe rebelled. But again, like Bruce was fighting karate guys or other types of martial artists, especially a lot of kung fu types, Mantis and Snake and other styles, in this thing. And so we had to create like all this mythos around that and gameplay mechanics. And then we had to explain like, okay, now why are all these martial artists coming together? And why are all these people working together? And why are these different styles coming together? And things like that, right? And so the world and the universe had to, create compelling reasons for action, conflict, and suspense, because, just like any, Hong Kong martial arts movie or most popcorn flicks these days, right? It becomes really hard to be like, why am I got my gun out and I'm going to fire and kill 1,000 people in this movie? Like, why do all these bad guys keep showing up, right? And at some point, they might just show up and I have to kill them, and we don't really try to explain it. But there's definitely a lot of movies out there where you're like, ooh, that kind of is weird, right? Like, why do I just keep fighting thing after thing after thing after thing? And why are all these things trying to kill me, right? All right, so moving along here. Go on this slide for a minute. So creating rules for your world building universe. So we've talked about this already a little bit. The rules, again, are very, very, very important in gameplay mechanics especially. You have to know generally what's good, what's bad, what works, what doesn't work. Games are about rules, right? So while rules are really important in world building at some levels for me to understand that rule, you do need to understand how that rules especially apply in the game mechanics, because rules really are all about, that's what games are all about, right? Games are about knowing these rules, knowing these patterns, like especially think about like boss fights and stuff, right? I mean, if a bot, it's very easy. You could program a boss, the AI for a boss, to completely be undefeatable. Just it's so strong and so powerful, so intelligent. It can heal itself. That basically a player would never have a chance, to do it. It can just go boink, and the player is dead, right? That's not fun. But a lot of games are really about rules, right? When I do X, this does Y, so I should do Z to defeat it, right? And certain types of enemies I need to use certain weapons against them. I need to use certain tactics against them. I need to use certain things, against these things, right? And that's something that that's really important in a game, right? And so keep in mind that while rules, when we talked about them in world building, were really important, they're even more important, when it comes to game design, right? And making sure that the consistency of your world is such that your gameplay mechanics and your game, and your world design are going to really go hand in hand and really be well understood by a player. And the player should know how those all work together. Again, kind of what do I have to do to get through the game to defeat this thing? And it might require a little bit of trial and error. But again, like I think I used an example recently about a game called Impossible Creatures, which I worked on. And that was a game where the universe was such that the people had figured out how to mutate creatures. And they basically could kind of DNA put together creatures at all these different levels. And then the creatures, in the game, it was an RTS. Ultimately, there was like 1 million combinations and hundreds of thousands of combinations, but you didn't know the rules. You didn't know if I combined this with this, it was always more powerful than this, because you didn't know what this thing was. Like, there was just too many combinations, right? And so there is a case of where the prime premise for the universe, i.e. the scientists that can create and mix and match genetically and build all these creatures, well, that seemed like it was a really good game design idea that gave us all these choices, user-generated content kind of at some levels, right? In the end, ultimately it was our downfall because it was too many choices and there was no really clear consistency. So again, I didn't know how to, as a player, deal with all these things because the rules were build something and then fight it against something. But typically in an RTS, in a real-time strategy game, we talked about kind of in that first slide, like, what are the conventions of that genre? What is that genre need? And typically in most strategy games or tactical games, you need to have rules and consistency, right? You need to know that, like, it's rock, paper, scissors, right? It's the Rochambeau of what am I going to do? And so that if I throw down a rock and you throw down your scissors, rock always beats scissors, paper beats, rock, and scissors beats paper, right? That's understood. That's great, elegant game design, right? And at the core basis, even though you might have 5 rocks, 10 scissors, and some different things that, are, water and whatever, and you're like, well, okay, well, the rock splashes in the water, but doesn't really damage it. The scissors get rusty and don't work as well when they're in water, and the water, dissolves paper, right? Like water would be an example of a fourth element. Like, how do you introduce that? And like, okay, now it's a little bit more complicated, but I still get the rules. I still understand, how that kind of works, right? And so that same general premise worked, but like with Impossible Creatures, those world, and the inconsistency in the world and the universe that we created, and the story and the background and the premise of the universe ultimately made, even though while it sounded like it would be a great idea from a game design's perspective, it ultimately was, again, what ruined the game, because there was too many choices and the lack of consistency in the rules were impossible to impart to a player. And so therefore the player just didn't know what to do and didn't know what was fun. And especially in a strategy game, they didn't know how to win, because strategy games especially are all about the rock, paper, scissors rules of like, okay, I might have one way through this, or I might have 3 ways through this, or I might even have 10 ways through it, but I know that there's a consistent path to victory. And generally, as a generalized rule, I know that if, the enemy is doing X and I do, Y, or maybe Y, Z, and, and A, B, and C, but at least I know, like, these are the ways I counter that, right? These are the ways that I defeat that tactic or that strategy. And so the rule of the gameplay mechanic, whether it's from, even which punch I throw and how I counter, just that second-to-second gameplay, all the way to bigger strategic level stuff of how do I win Command and Conquer at a large-scale level, or some other kind of game, right? That same consistency in the universe is needed, and in the rule sets and stuff like that, right? And so that's where, again, the game mechanics and the universe and world building have to really be in sync and understand and support each other. And so it would have been the kind of thing that, going back to it, and if I had the choice, which at the time on Impossible Creatures was not a game I had the choice on, I was managing it, but not, the head of creative on it. So I didn't have final say, even though I kept pushing them towards, changing it. I lost. But in that particular case, what I would have personally done is I would have backed off on this, like, okay, there's an unlimited number of choices, right? And I would have broken things down into categories. And I would have said there's a certain number of categories of things that relate to strength, a certain set of categories that maybe relate to flying and types of attacks, whether that's attacks that are biting damage, range damage, damage over time, area of effect, whatever that is, right? And then categorize these things into these things that were recognizable, created a series of creatures that were, within each one of those categories, but made it easily recognizable to know, like, when I looked at a creature, what was its strengths and weaknesses in each one of these categories, or what category is it in these cases, like type of attack. And then at least knowing if there's 5 or 10 of these things as a limit, then when I would look at a creature, I would know what it is, and I would know how to build a counter for that and know how to defeat it. But by having an unlimited number of choices, it screwed the game, right? And so having limits sometimes is much better, and limits are rules, right? And so keep that in mind, that again, in that particular case, you could have kept your story 95, 98% the same. The scientists develop these, these things, and they let you mutate creatures and build your own creatures and create some interesting combinations. And then it would be up for you to figure out, like, how do I use those things in a particular strategy or tactic that allowed me to play in it, but I would still feel like I was part of this special universe where these things had developed, right? And then from a gameplay design, a game mechanics perspective, understanding like, okay, what are things that dramatically change the gameplay? And what are things that maybe can just affect it, where the rock, paper, scissors of the game mechanics could be affected by a bunch of stuff that maybe doesn't matter a lot, but allows me to kind of min-max my character within a certain range, but the min-maxing stays within a tolerance level that it still fits and still allows my universe or my IP to have a lot of variety, but without it breaking the game. And another example of that to talk about would be like the game Ratchet Deadlock. When I did Ratchet Deadlock, we created a weapon modification system, and that weapon modification system was such that, we had 10 slots in a weapon. You could find and earn these different items that could go into each slot. You could take an item out of a slot, you could put it into a slot, or take it out of a slot, put it into a different weapon, whatever. So you could reconfigure your guns. And you could basically, they would, like one would give you increased speed, so your rate of fire. Some would give you increased damage. Some would give you increased reloading time. Some would give you increased range, and all these kinds of things. And, you could put 10 of them on a weapon, but any one of no combination through testing, no combination. I could put 10 of the same thing or 10 different things in there, and it didn't matter because it all sort of balanced in the end. Having, a really fast shooting BB gun is still was just as effective against somebody who had, kind of the equivalent of a BFG or something like a long range grenade, or short range grenade launcher that, took a minute to fire every time, and it may have done a lot of damage, but it was slow, and in the end, the damage per second and, and all the other factors balanced, right? And so that's where your game world can reinforce, your gameplay mechanics. So you have to kind of understand what are those tolerances for what your game world needs, and what does your player want to see, and what are the strategy and tactics that go into reinforcing what your world has and what reality sort of is in your world with the game mechanics and the things that you're needed here. Another example of this would be, this is a problem with a lot of modern day games that take place in modern day military stuff, and especially even older games with older military, where the options and the types of weapons and things available were less, right? And so for example, if you did a modern day game and you have, and it may fit in the reality of the world, right? And this is where, again, is it a simulation? Are you trying to be historically accurate or not? But, like, you could give the person an M4, an AK-47, a Galil, and a million other variants, and they're all assault rifles, right? And so for those of you that know anything about guns and like guns, they basically, for all intents and purposes, unless you're super OCD about things, they have roughly the same range, they have roughly the same caliber. And yes, you could argue that a .223 caliber versus a .308 caliber are different. They definitely a .308 does have a lot more power, and can have some differences. But to an average player, to an average consumer, they're almost exactly the same. And they just see them as a machine gun, right? And so unless you're a hardcore military game player, and if that's your audience, it's fine to be, and put up, and make a game that just has a bunch of machine guns. But if that's what your world is, if your universe and your story and whatever just sets up something that says, well, you know what, we're just going to give you, whatever it is, we're going to put you on a ship, right? And these terrorists attack the ship, and the terrorists attack the ship, and the terrorists, bring along a bunch of M4s, and then if you guys don't know, an M4 is what the modern, that's what the U.S. military currently uses as its main standard battle rifle. So it's a variant of the AR-15, or what originally started as an M16. So just in case you don't know guns. again, as a game designer, these are the kinds of things sometimes you got to know, right? These are those differences. Like, to go do a game like Rainbow Six, you better know your guns, right? You better know these things and know them inside out and understand that gun culture, understand people that shoot guns, understand those things, because those nuances will come back to bite you in the butt if you don't. So, that being said, if that's all your story in your world, and I'm talking about, like in this particular case, again, maybe your game is taking place on a freighter, that these terrorists decide to hijack, right? Or on an airliner, that again, the passenger 57, the terrorists take over the plane, and everybody's got the same gun on the plane, right? Now that could be okay, but now you're back to the same problem of there's only one of that thing, right? And so now me as a game player, if I'm the guy that's gonna go in and play this game and I only have one gun, and that it comes back to the 2-pistol thing, right? I just got that one gun, so that means my strategy, my tactics, my gameplay is going to be very, 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 very limited in general because I just got that one gun, right? And I may have very limited ammo. Now, if I'm building a stealth game and I'm building something around that and it's more about sneaking and I got some hand-to-hand combat, maybe I find a knife, and I can do some other stuff to break it up. Again, that might be okay. But you can, as a writer and as a world builder, can get yourself in trouble because you're, again, thinking that, like, oh, this makes sense logically, right? The terrorists take over this, this boat or this thing, and they buy all their weapons from the same place, and they're just going to use those weapons on it, and then the player gets new weapons by taking out the terrorists, and using those. Well, that's great, but make sure that your gameplay, your game design, has enough variety in it that it's going to be fun. So in that particular case, probably don't give every single terrorist on the ship the exact same weapon. Give a sniper rifle here, a submachine gun there, a pistol there, a knife there. Give things that, that make sense in the context, or come up with reasons why they have that, right? The terrorists might bring a sniper rifle to be able to protect against, a U.S. ship that's going to come and try to retake them or something, right? So they can reach out a little bit farther. They might bring surface-to-air missiles because they're going to try to defend themselves against, aerial attacks, from helicopters trying to land on themselves. They might get, a variety of different things. They bring explosives so they can wire doors shut. So think about your world. Think about how that world builds. But then again, you got to come back to gameplay mechanics and go like, what does the player need to make this thing fun, right? And if I am going to be stuck in this one thing forever or for a long period of time, do I have enough variety in mechanics and stuff from a strategic, tactical level or interest level to make that thing fun, right? And that's where, again, I'm just trying to show you guys these concrete examples of how to think about, building out this universe and building out this story, but then also kind of stopping and going like, okay, but what does the player need, right? What's the player going to do, for weapons? Is he going to be grabbing pots and pans and, and is he grabbing, weapons that are, made out of makeshift, or, is he going to be using tools and big, wrenches and things like that? Like that's all possible, right? Those are things that you would find on a big ship, right? Or something. And so that stuff makes sense in the logical world of that, of that thing, right? But at the same hand, will you find a laser weapon or find some other kind of thing? Maybe not, right? Like why is it there, right? What is this weapon? Why does it kind of exist there? And that's something you have to kind of try to keep in mind. So next, this was again the creating something unique that we talked about last week. So moving along. So we've kind of been talking about this throughout this whole thing. I won't dwell on this slide too much. But again, just like in your world, your gameplay needs to be unique enough. Not, again, it does not need to be 100% unique. Again, the 80-20 or 70-30 rule of some stuff that people are familiar with and some things that are unique can be good enough. But again, it needs to fit the game world. just like we just talked about a minute ago on the ship, or in Impossible Creatures, or things like that. That you want to make sure that these things fit. Do these things fit the game genre that you're making? You could put in a special weapon that makes no sense at all, for that particular kind of game, but can you fit it in? I don't know. I mean, that's the kind of stuff, again, that you want to kind of go back and forth and go like, okay, well, how do I do this thing, right? That sounds interesting, or would be a unique mechanic, and something like that, right? And so, and then what does that contribute to the game, and how does that work? So again, it can be really, really, really important for you to create, again, unique gameplay. And I can't undersell that enough. Again, you want to make sure that there is unique gameplay in your game, and you don't want it to just be 100% a rehash. And unfortunately, I've seen this with a number of people over the years, and students and even seasoned designers who are given a task to say, go make the next Call of Duty kind of thing, right? And I'm not talking about an actual person making a Call of Duty franchise game, but just like, go make an original game, create a new original world, and then make it competitive to Call of Duty. And then literally they will take 100% of the features from Call of Duty and then put it in a new location with a new storyline with new characters and go, okay, all done. And you're like why? I mean, yes, story, location, exciting characters, like, yes, you have to make something new and unique there, right? I'm not debating that fact, but if 100% of, or 95% of all of your gameplay is the same as another game, it's not going to be well received, right? And so you do need to kind of understand that and understand how much new stuff to put in, and for a second. And then, what's that balance between something that's new, something that's original, and how much does your particular game need, right? And what's the balance there? So, your existing IP worlds, we've talked about this in the previous weeks, but, in your existing IP gameplay, again, if you're making the next Call of Duty, like me with Rainbow Six, I was doing a sequel, right? I was making a game that was supposed to be a sequel. Now, in some cases, if you're moving, say, from Halo 1 to Halo 2, if you look at the level of gameplay, that was in the differences in gameplay between 1 and 2 in Halo, it was very small, right? It was mostly new story and new level designs. Excuse me. And that's okay. And not every game, as a sequel or within an existing world, has to be super incredibly innovative, right? But in the same hand, like in Rainbow Six Vegas, there had been 5 previous Rainbow Six games. That game and that genre, even though it was an FPS, was really a niche, pretty hardcore FPS. It was very more realistic, and I would say borderline simulation. The health and damage systems were one shot, one kill for the most part. It was brutally hard, and I would almost put it into a category of like a puzzle game, right? In that it was like you had to figure out how to get through a level, and like literally it was like 2 steps forward, 1 left, oh, dead, okay. 2 steps forward, 1 right. Okay, I'm alive. Now 2 steps, no, okay. 1 right, 1 left again, right again, forward, and you're trying to figure out how to get through these levels, because the designers just had them set up in such a way that you couldn't really, they weren't very fun, right? It was not a forgiving game. And so they did okay, and they appealed to a certain niche people that wanted to be special forces and wanted to, to do that kind of thing, right? And so that was okay to do. But, my job was to reinvent the franchise, and so in that particular case, everything was on the table for reinvention, and it was really about, okay, what do I want to do? What's right for the IP? What's right for the universe, right? And where do I go, and stuff from there, right? And that was something that was hard for me to figure out, and redo. But again, I had a lot of stuff that I started with, but I still had to figure out, what stayed and what went, what changed, and what wasn't going to change, what was core of the franchise, what was core of the player experience, what the players want. And so you do need to figure out what that world is. And in my particular case, it was modern military, but the Rainbow Six team had certain priorities. It had certain things. It's not going to go, they're special forces counter-terrorist units, right? They aren't going to necessarily go fight certain types of criminals. They're not going to go, they're not detectives. They're going to go track down a murderer. They're not policemen, those kinds of things, right? They're badass special forces, and they're fighting terrorists, and that's what the IP in the world, demanded. And that's what the players wanted to be. The players wanted to be a rainbow character. The players didn't want to go be a cop, right? And that's why they played that game. And so you had to understand the subtle differences. Like a cop has a gun, a bounty hunter has a gun, lots of people have guns. That doesn't mean that they're the best of the best of the best special forces elite units, right? And that's who Rainbow was. So my IP dictated, my world and world building that came before me, both the Tom Clancy book that it was written off of, as well as the 5 games that preceded me, all had a certain amount of history to them and a certain amount of gameplay mechanics, characters, and bad guys and things like that you had to kind of go and look at all that stuff, right? And go like, okay, where's my new unique place to be? Where's my unique home? And how do I make this different and special? And so I had to, of course, read the book, understand all the games, in theory, and really understand what, again, was right for the player. I did a lot of research on just military tactics, military in general, special forces. I had special forces advisors, Mossad advisor. I had like all sorts of just crazy people that also helped me. And even though a lot of it was in my lap, we did have some great people to help us understand that world and the world that we were trying to live in, and trying to straddle that really delicate balance between kind of simulation and reality, and how to make a fun game. But all of those guys had great ideas, and the books and everything else had great ideas that inspired me of game design and game features and things like that. So for just give you one last example in Rainbow Six, 2 examples, the 2 gameplay mechanics that were really the change for the series, besides the health system, but the 2 new gameplay mechanics that really revolutionized Rainbow Six was its cover system, and being able to take cover. Because that's something, if you're a special forces dude, you're not just going to be running around going, like on Real Tournament, I'm just going to be running through some world and please don't shoot me, right? Like, that's not how they function. That's not how they work. The cover system was critical. And then the second thing that we did, just because it was darn cool, was the repelling system. And I think we were one of the first games, or the first game, to have an actual system that you could repel down a building. And then we even designed a system where in that you could flip upside down and you could actually shoot people through a window, while you're upside down looking through a window on the outside of a building, and things like that. So again, those mechanics made sense because that's who we were in the world. And those were mechanics that I thought about as I was watching videos and things. And I saw all these elite special forces guys like doing all this repelling. And I was like, ooh, that's kind of cool. Like, that's pretty fun. It's pretty exciting. I get to slide down this building, and of course, when I first brought that to the programmers were like, you're smoking something. Like, that's just insane. Like, we can't do that. That's way too hard. And then it was kind of like, well, hold on a second. Let me explain in my head what I'm thinking, and let me understand how that works. And eventually they're like, actually, we can do that, and so it became an interesting thing. It became a huge mechanic in the game, that was very fun and very innovative, right? But it fit the world. It fit who we were. It fit the real world skills But it became something that we allowed them to do more because it was exciting than necessarily the fact that it needed to be something that, we were the SEALs and Special Forces. But you'll notice, like, we never went in water. We didn't, we were a SEAL type team, or the equivalency of, but we never introduced water in the game, right? Whereas SEALs are predominantly water-based, but we still didn't have that as part of our, mythos. So you don't necessarily have to do everything. So backstory and history, can be a huge part of stuff, but let's talk about, where and how does that affect gameplay? Now, this could come into your game design and your gameplay in a lot of different ways. I'm just going to touch on a few of them today because we're running out of time. And again, everybody, thanks again for joining. We've got about 10 more minutes. So if anybody has any questions, thanks again for hanging in there today and listening to me ramble pointlessly and endlessly. But if you got any questions, please speak up now. And remember, I'll say it now just before everybody leaves at the last second. Remember, no classes, no live streams for 2 weeks. We will start again, I believe, January 5th, and this class will be delayed 1 hour later than usual, starting in January. So just want you guys to be aware of that, and happy holidays and all that kind of stuff too. But let me kind of keep cranking through just a couple more things here in the last 10 minutes. But just in case any of you were jetting out early, just want to remind you and wish you to be safe, and hopefully I pray you get a chance to see your families, or at least talk to them over this holidays. I know it's a difficult year for everybody this year. I know a significant number of friends who are home alone this year, and choosing to not take risks to be with their family members, and it's really hard, and so hopefully everybody's, going to look out for themselves and their families this year and their friends and do what's right. Okay, so backstory and history. There's a lot of ways that this can come into play. Now, in some cases, it literally could be the equivalency of time travel. Now, time travel does not necessarily in a game have to be literal. So time travel, could be literally there's a machine, there's a device, I have an inherent ability, or something happens that I literally, as my character, travel through time, right? And so that, so I could go back in time or maybe forward, right? But that's not, the time travel is actually a later slide. We will get to that. But this is sort of an equivalency of it in that it is possible in some games and in some times, in the same way that we have flashbacks, in the same way that we might have, stuff that's kind of coming in. It could be a book I pick up and read. It could be an old recording that I'm watching on a TV that's on a loop. You'll see this in The Walking Dead or things, or various shows where there's something that's, a distress message that's been running for a year, and it's still running, and we're getting this kind of glimpse into the past, right? We're getting this thing there. Well, how does that affect gameplay? Well, maybe, the player has a whole level that's a flashback. I've seen that in some games where you literally go back in time, right? And, and even though you're not technically time traveling, it's more of like play a memory or whatever, or play another character back in time. And now suddenly we go back and play as that thing, and we do something there. And then we cut, when I wake up and now I'm back in my new time or something like that. That you could do that in a game, right? And that could be doing things there. And there's lots of ways that you could play off of that. But history also has, again, a way of affecting the world, right? And so the history and the mechanics of what we do and how we affect that world, right, are very different and very interesting, right? And how we're progressing the players from, maybe a point in time to where they are now, and why are things the way they are now. And so a lot of things, a lot of the motivations in our storylines, a lot of the motivations, or why does this group have these weapons, right? This could be history. This could be backstory. This could be things that are important to understand. And it could even be kind of a puzzle. For example, a group could have a particular weapon, like a bomb, and so you're, one hand, you know that you have to deal with this group that has the bomb, but you could also learn that the the group, bought this from a bomb maker. The bomb maker had 10 of these bombs, and the bomb maker is looking to sell the other bombs, right? And they're out on the field somewhere, right? They're in play, or they're getting ready to be in play. And so the history of like, okay, now maybe I have one terrorist that I've managed to capture, and he's feeding me basically his backstory, like what was his life or whatever. How did he make the connection with this bomb maker ultimately, and then tracing that back to how the bomb maker got the bomb and how he got the materials and like all these things. And so like in a modern day detective kind of scenario, I could be using the history and the backstory as a way to generate missions, as a way to generate features. Again, certain people have bombs, or they have certain weapons, or certain, anger, they're more likely to blow it up, because they want to take out the president, or they've got some history there that basically makes them, pissed off at that person, that group, that faction, whatever it is. And, and that's why they're targeting them or trying to do what they're doing, right? All bad guys need some inherent motivation. And most of that comes through history. Most of that is like, why'd they get so angry, right? Why they don't just wake up usually tomorrow and suddenly like, megalomaniac, I'm going to take over the world, right? I mean, maybe in your story that happened, right? But there's generally history, abuse, other things that happened. And then, can those mechanics or can those events be turned into mechanics, gameplay, or other kinds of things? And it could even be, all the way down to the history and the backstory of like, why does the player character have certain abilities, certain skills, certain weapons, all these kinds of things. Like, why is he a badass? Like, he used to be, this, right? He used to be special forces. He used to be that. He still has, he might be retired, but he has his old contacts in the CIA. He's got his old military contacts. He's got a secret bunker with a bunch of guns in it because he collected them when he was, in the service. So, there's lots of reasons that those things can exist, but those things are really history, right? That set up now mechanics because they've established why and who and what the player is and his skills, his equipment, his gear, his contacts. And that could lead to, again, quests all the way down to the equipment that he has access to or has the ability to use. Like, if I was making a game about my life and then suddenly I see a helicopter and then I run over and jump in the helicopter and start flying it, it might be a little bit out of place, right? And even some movies like True Lies, you can kind of see the box up there. There's a movie poster on my wall, but I worked on True Lies, way back when, as a visual effects artist. And, in that movie, if you guys have seen it, remember it, Arnold Schwarzenegger, at one point, there's a Harrier. The first nuke is about to go off on the island, and they know that there's another nuke, going to in Florida, and Miami, and so Arnold runs, and even though he's currently CIA or the equivalency of their secret group, but they play off. He has a lot of skills already. He has a lot of abilities. He definitely is a total badass. And he has resources and things, but he also suddenly like runs and jumps in the Harrier and, it starts to take off, but they made a joke out of it. And it was great because they were like, is he skilled to do that? Like, does he have that ability? And Tom Arnold's like, yeah, don't worry. Like, he's got thousands of hours of training. And, thanks to Vlasmir. Yeah, it was a really fun movie. And if you haven't seen it, by the way, go see it. Like, the True Lies really, I mean, I'm biased because I worked on it and I love the movie. But it really was a masterful movie at a lot of different levels, and you'll love it if you haven't seen it. Now, the last, story was just as he starts to take off, like, you think that he's just this like complete badass, but then suddenly like he's like roar, and he's smashing these cop cars, and he like just can barely kind of take off, and and he just it took him a few minutes, and everybody's running for cover, and things like that, because it was like he was very rusty, right? But they kind of explained it away. Yes, he had training there, but in the same hand, he wasn't just a complete badass, like, expert pilot from minute one, and that explained, certain things. And they turned it into a comedy element and kind of a part of the story, but they did explain it, right? And so it's kind of one of those things where, yes, he could have just jumped in the Harrier and taken off like a pro and gone off and flying off into the sunset to save the world. But, they used that point to try to show that he was a human being. He had his limitations. His new gameplay mechanic at this point was, I got to now fly a Harrier jet. So if I was a game player playing Arnold Schwarzenegger in that movie, like, yes, now I've got a new game mechanic. I get to fly airplanes, right? But I'm still pretty bad at it. And so just like in the real world, it's like, oh, okay, I'm barely doing this thing. And, but eventually maybe I get better and then I'm flying smooth at some point. But you could play it up and show that as a mechanic, and whatever, that why can I do this thing? Why do I have this skill and ability? And you don't always have to explain everything. But when something like that, I think in True Lies, in that case with the Harrier, like, yes, that became a great mechanic. And again, if that had been a game, would it be a perfect way? That would have been that perfect feature. Even if he had just flown the Harrier, for 30 minutes, and landed it, in Atlanta, in Florida, and then gotten out and then fought the terrorists on foot and never actually fought and did the whole Harrier sequence, it still would have given you, like, as a game designer, would have given you a hook. They just said, like, hey, this guy who you're going to eventually play in the game, when we're making True Lies, the video game, this guy can fly an airplane, right? And so now, where can we go with that, right? So maybe in the movie, he only flies it for 30 seconds, but it establishes the fact that he has some piloting skills and some abilities there, and maybe he drives a tank for a second, right? And then everybody's like, yeah, same thing, like, I can drive a tank, and I can fly helicopters, and I can fly an airplane, and those things get kind of established in your IP, and then, you go on to use them as game mechanics in your game. But that backstory and history is what allowed him to have those skills, which explain why some of his gameplay features exist. So hopefully that makes sense. We're out of time, unfortunately, today, guys. I hope you're enjoying this. We will continue with this talk. We didn't even get halfway through the slides today. I apologize. But again, I hope you're finding this all interesting, useful, and will hopefully help you all make better games and better worlds and all that kind of stuff, in the years to come. So, once again, everybody, Big Glob, everybody, the Blasphemer, you're always welcome. Again, everybody, please be safe this holiday season. Be careful. It's crazy out there, and yes, stay safe, everybody, and truly, honestly, wish you all the best holidays, and hope that you just have an incredible next few weeks, and a happy New Year's and all that stuff. And I look forward to seeing you next year. And let's pray that 2021 is better. So that's all I can say, because this year I just can't wait to end, and I'm sure you guys are all the same. So again, take care, everybody, and we'll see you all next year. Bye now.